But I want to just start. We've got a small group here today, and I think that's quite a nice thing to do, because actually we can have some quite intimate conversations about this. Everything's obviously confidential. We don't even name in names of schools and things like that. I'm really interested in what you feel your biggest challenge is currently as a leader of literacy. And it might be around students' literacy levels and staff and their competency. It might be you and how you feel. You might be new to the role, but I'm really interested to know what our starting point is. So if you can have a think about that now, and then put what your biggest challenge in the chat, that'd be really helpful. Thank you. Okay, so when you're ready, if you can. Thank you, that's fantastic. Let's see what we've got. Brilliant. Yeah, okay, Beth, thank you for that. Yeah, getting subject areas to own a responsibility for supporting. And it's like everybody's business. Yeah, I think there's two levels to that, isn't it? One is that kind of communicates that moral imperative, and them saying that they're on board with literacy drives, but actually getting them to do that day in, day out is a real challenge. Absolutely. Thanks, Chelsea. Interventions and timetabling them is an absolute nightmare. Absolute, yeah, good. Yeah, and that's a reality, I think, Catherine. I think when you go from school to school, there can be completely different approaches to literacy leadership. When I started off teaching, my first kind of TLR role, it was called an honorarium back then, but that literacy leadership role was seen as a role for novice teachers who wanted to get onto that first ladder, ring of the ladder. And actually, if you were to read some of the DFE kind of guidance that came out quite recently around struggling readers and supporting readers in secondary, they're finally getting that message across that actually it needs to come from top down, and you need somebody on that senior leadership team that's really strategically leading on this across the school. Thank you very much for that, for your honesty as well. I think we are all going to be sharing these same challenges, myself included. Mine's just on a slightly bigger scale because I've got different schools that I'm kind of grappling with these challenges. So one of the things I think about this is the disconnect. I, on a personal day-to-day basis, find that there are so many priorities happening in schools, even within trusts and individual schools having slightly different priorities, that literacy can often feel like it's disconnected from those main priorities. And I like this analogy of a jigsaw, because very often I feel like all these bits of the jigsaw, whether you're looking at behaviour and routines or metacognition or feedback or assessment, that sort of thing, I often feel like literacy is like the jigsaw piece that's put in like around the edges, and I just wish that people had put it in first. That's the first piece of the jigsaw, and everything else kind of develops around it. And I think, whenever you read about a teaching model in a school, you very rarely see explicit references to reading, writing and numeracy. There's some brilliant teaching and learning models out there. We use Great Teacher Toolkit as a kind of overarching principles, but nowhere does it talk explicitly about literacy. It's always the add-on. And I think because of that, as leaders, we're then left to our own devices to kind of muddle our way through this, to compete against these other priorities. And yet literacy really should be that central piece of the jigsaw. So it's about how can we manage other people around us in school, whether we are managing a team or we're managing upwards to senior leadership, how can we bring them on board, and see it as central? So if we're focusing on supporting sending mainstream, well, we've got to think of that through a literacy lens and so on. Now, sorry, I'll go back on that one. I think one of the other things that is a key challenge is, I think, if you talk to other literacy leaders and people in school, they'll say things like, oh, well, policy's always changing. You know, whichever government we've got, they've all got different priorities, which to a certain extent is obviously true. But for the last 100 years, educationalists and researchers have been repeating the same messages. And I think this is important to share with those who make those big decisions in schools, because even like from 1922, educationalist George Sampson was talking about this idea that every teacher is a teacher of English because every teacher is a teacher in English and through that language. And then we had the Bullitt Report in the 1970s, talking about, again, language across the curriculum. We had updates to the national curriculum and so on, updates to the Ofsted Inspection Handbook. All of these people have been emphasising for years that literacy is the responsibility of everybody. And of course, it requires individuals like ourselves to lead that and at a strategic level. But disciplinary literacy, and I know this is a big buzzword at the minute, but it's really important. It's the key to unlocking learning across our curriculum in school. And that's why literacy needs to be placed at the heart of our teaching and learning policies. You know, and if they're still not convinced, you can show them over time all of these Ofsted reports that have come out over the years. I mean, some of the, you know, if you've been in education for a while, will remember some of these reports, from removing barriers to literacy. Then the year after, we had moving English forward. Then we had a shared responsibility the year after. Somebody was busy over those 3 years, I think. But the common kind of thread through these is the message that it is the responsibility of everybody. And if you want to support students to be successful in other subjects, you've got to support them in terms of accessing that curriculum. And I particularly like that quote in the middle from the Moving English report, because it talks about, you know, if we're only saying that it's the English teacher's job to develop reading and writing, you know, how many hours of that a week is that really? 4 or 5 hours maximum. So if that is not replicated everywhere else, those efforts are lost, aren't they? So, you know, you've got lots of ammunition there to go back to people to try to kind of raise that profile, to elevate that status. And I mentioned this earlier on. So the DfE last year brought out this new report. It was a kind of a research review about reading in the secondary school. It was very much needed, and I think it's a very sensible report. So HMI inspectors basically reported in this that when they went into schools, secondary schools in particular, they rarely saw leaders developing a coordinated strategy for struggling readers. Now, I'm going to talk about reading. Obviously, I know there's other aspects of literacy, but that's going to be the thread through today. And what they were saying was, you know, there were pockets of good practice, but it wasn't joined up. There wasn't a sense of coherence. So they were saying, you know, it's really important that we've got this coordinated strategy so that people can access the curriculum. And, you know, they saw English departments identifying the weakest readers. They had their own strategy, but maybe they weren't then talking to the SENCO and the team who support students with special educational needs. There was no kind of synergy there, okay? And they also summed up how, without a carefully thought out and implemented strategy behind these approaches, what some secondary schools are doing becomes tokenistic and implemented at a real surface level.